NVIDIA, from $140 billion to $3 trillion in 2 years, the financial world is accustomed to witnessing meteoric rises and sudden collapses. A chaotic symphony played out across global stock exchanges, yet what has transpired with NVIDIA Corporation over the span of roughly 24 months defies typical categorization, shattering established metrics of corporate scaling and market capitalization velocity. This is not merely a successful stock run, it is a fundamental epoch-making revaluation of a single entity, transitioning it from a specialized component vendor into the foundational infrastructure provider of a new industrial revolution. In the early months of 2022, NVIDIA was, by all conventional standards, a colossal company, valued at approximately $140 billion. This valuation placed it firmly among the upper echelon of global technology players, recognized primarily for its dominant position in the high-end gaming graphics processing unit, or GPU market. It was a respected giant, certainly, but still viewed through the lens of hardware manufacturing, subject to cyclical demands, inventory fluctuations, and the volatile nature of consumer electronics. Analysts and investors understood its quality, admired the brand loyalty it commanded, and acknowledged its nascent, growing footprint in the data center space. But no sane projection, no discounted cash flow model built on known variables, could have possibly forecast the unprecedented trajectory that was about to unfold. Fast forward to the present day, and the figure stands starkly different, a market capitalization that has not just doubled or quadrupled, but has ascended past the dizzying and rarely crossed threshold of $3 trillion. In the brief, intense flash of just 2 years, NVIDIA did not just grow, it transformed itself into one of the 3 most valuable companies on the planet, an entity whose valuation now surpasses the gross domestic product of major industrialized nations and fundamentally redefines the concept of technological leverage. How does a company, initially pegged as a high-performance hardware specialist, manage to compound its value by a factor of over 20 times in such a constrained time frame? What hidden tectonic shift occurred beneath the surface of the industry to unlock this idiosyncratic brilliance? The answer lies buried deep within a decade-long strategic gambit, an investment in foundational architecture and ecosystem control that the broader market largely dismissed as tangential, or at best merely futile. To truly appreciate the scale of this ascent, we must first establish the dramatic conflict that preceded it. The year 2022 was brutal for technology stocks, fueled by rising inflation and the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hiking campaign. The lavish valuations assigned during the pandemic boom were corrected with ruthless efficiency. NVIDIA itself faced significant headwinds entirely separate from macroeconomics. The speculative frenzy surrounding cryptocurrency mining, which had previously devoured vast quantities of their consumer-grade GPUs, suddenly collapsed. This triggered a massive, systemic inventory glut. Retail channels were saturated, demand evaporated overnight, and the company was forced to confront the harsh reality of its dependence on the highly cyclical, fickle consumer market. Market sentiment became deeply skeptical. Was this just another hardware company whose success was built on fleeting fads like gaming and crypto? The data center segment, while growing, was still measured in hundreds of millions of dollars of quarterly revenue, relatively small compared to the billions pouring in from gaming. The common narrative suggested that competition would inevitably catch up. Surely AMD, Intel, and a slew of ambitious startups would eventually produce functionally equivalent hardware at lower cost, commoditizing the GPU space. The tension built, a recognized technological leader trapped in a commodity cycle, facing economic contraction and market pessimism. The stock price suffered, dipping significantly from its earlier peaks, reflecting genuine investor confusion regarding its long-term competitive moat. Yet while the external world focused on the immediate supply chain woes and crypto downturns, something entirely distinct was happening behind the scenes. An investment thesis forged almost 2 decades earlier by CEO Jensen Huang was finally reaching its moment of critical mass. The open loop that explains the company's decoupling from the general tech malaise is not merely the development of faster silicon. It is the creation and rigorous enforcement of a proprietary software ecosystem known as CUDA, or Compute Unified Device Architecture. CUDA was introduced in 2006, far earlier than any practical, widespread application for general-purpose GPU computing existed. It allowed programmers to utilize the massively parallel processing power of NVIDIA GPUs, which were designed to render millions of pixels simultaneously, for complex mathematical tasks far removed from graphics rendering. This was the true, silent foundation of NVIDIA's eventual monolithic valuation. While competitors focused solely on maximizing teraflops raw processing speed, NVIDIA focused relentlessly on maximizing developer productivity and locking in intellectual capital. This strategic choice created a critical, often underestimated asymmetry in the technology landscape. To perform advanced machine learning, deep neural network training, or complex scientific simulations, researchers and developers did not just need parallel processors, they needed established tools, stable libraries, comprehensive documentation, debugging environments, and a robust community sharing solutions. CUDA provided all of this. It became the de facto operating system for high-performance computing and, crucially, for artificial intelligence development. The importance of this cannot be overstated. By the time the AI revolution began to accelerate dramatically, nearly every major research institute, every cutting-edge machine learning algorithm, and every foundational software framework, TensorFlow, PyTorch, Copay, was fundamentally optimized, or in many cases outright dependent upon the CUDA architecture. Even if a rival chipmaker could design a piece of silicon that offered superior theoretical performance, the simple fact was that the decades of software investment were impossible to replicate quickly. Building a functional CUDA alternative is not a year-long project. It is a decade-long pursuit requiring trillions of lines of adapted code and institutional adoption. This moat, built of software and developer loyalty, was orders of magnitude stronger than any hardware advantage. The shift was subtle but absolute. NVIDIA ceased to be a supplier of chips and began to function as an exclusive gateway to the most critical computational infrastructure of the 21st century. Consider the immense scale of this re-engagement when we look at the journey from $140 billion to $3 trillion to $3 trillion. We are witnessing the market waking up, in real time, to the realization that NVIDIA holds the choke point on the only commodity that matters in the age of generative AI: specialized parallel compute power, accessible only through their ecosystem. The company wasn't selling commodity processors, they were selling the indispensable machinery required to manufacture intelligence itself. This leads us to the critical inflection point, the climax of part 1 of this explosive narrative. For years, the market had treated the data center segment as a promising growth area. Then came late 2022, and with it, the global viral explosion of large language models and generative AI applications, epitomized by the sudden, widespread accessibility of platforms like OpenAI's ChatGPT. This was the trigger. Generative AI is uniquely computationally intensive. Training models with hundreds of billions or even trillions of parameters requires an unprecedented scale of parallel processing. Suddenly, the need for accelerated computing units transformed from an optional efficiency measure into an existential necessity for every major hyperscaler: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, every ambitious startup, and every nation-state seeking technological parity. The industry quickly realized that only one specialized product could meet this sudden, near-infinite demand: the NVIDIA data center GPU, specifically the flagship A100 and its successor, the H100 Hopper architecture. The H100, built specifically for the unforgiving demands of transformer model architectures, became the most sought-after industrial asset on the planet. Its demand curve was not linear or even polynomial. It was a near vertical line approaching infinity. Companies were not purchasing hundreds of these units, they were ordering tens of thousands, committing billions of dollars in capital expenditure simply to acquire access to the infrastructure required to stay relevant in the AI race. They could not wait for alternatives. They needed compute power now, and only NVIDIA could deliver it. Thanks to the CUDA ecosystem that ensured immediate operational compatibility and maximum efficiency, the consequence was instantaneous and profoundly disruptive. The data center segment revenue began to explode, not growing at 10 or 20%, but leaping by 300% quarter-over-quarter. Inventory gluts vanished, replaced by multi-quarter backlogs that could not be filled fast enough. The market received its first undeniable sign of this seismic shift in the now legendary earnings report of May 2023, where NVIDIA shocked analysts by projecting quarterly revenue far beyond even the most aggressive estimates. A clear signal that the company had detached itself entirely from the previous rules governing semiconductor economics. The conflict, the fear of cyclical commodity business, was resolved with the undeniable revelation: they were selling infrastructure for the future, and everyone needed it yesterday. This monumental pivot, driven by 2 decades of strategic software investment and accelerated by the sudden, insatiable hunger for foundational AI compute, forms the bedrock of the most rapid value accumulation in modern history. The $140 billion company was merely a chrysalis. The $3 trillion valuation represents the unleashing of a true monopoly on the engine of future intelligence. But the story does not end with this realization. While NVIDIA solved the problem of necessity, the rapid transition to a $3 trillion entity introduces entirely new, critical challenges. Can the supply chain scale fast enough to meet the geopolitical demands of sovereign AI clouds and the unprecedented capital expenditure of the hyperscalers? Will the incredible profit margins currently hovering near 70% on these critical components attract the kind of serious, subsidized competition that eventually erodes any technology monopoly? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the very customers funding this explosion, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, decide they must build their own captive hardware solutions to break the NVIDIA dependency? The market has now priced in technological dominance. The question for part 2 is whether NVIDIA can execute the massive logistical, competitive, and strategic maneuvering necessary to defend a valuation that suggests not just success, but perpetual, unchallenged technological control over the operating system of artificial intelligence. The numbers defied gravity. a $140 billion enterprise anchored firmly in the cyclical rhythms of the gaming graphics market, was suddenly catapulted to $3 trillion in roughly 24 months, a pace of wealth creation that historically took decades even for tech giants like Apple or Microsoft during their most aggressive growth periods. This was not merely appreciation. It was hyper-acceleration, a geometric progression of value that fundamentally reset expectations for market performance in the 21st century. But the true significance of the surge isn't just the total valuation. It's the unprecedented bottleneck NVIDIA engineered at the very foundation of the modern economy, positioning itself as the indispensable sovereign of the accelerating digital future. This ascent represented more than simple market enthusiasm for artificial intelligence. It spoke to a profound, deep-seated structural dependency that the entire global technology apparatus suddenly found itself trapped within. This was not just a chip shortage or a momentary advantage, it was a carefully constructed knowledge monopoly, deeply woven into the fabric of computational physics, complex machine learning workflows, and data center efficiency protocols. The ultimate and pressing question facing every major corporation, every sovereign government, and every disruptive startup was stark and singular. Could anyone realistically escape the gravitational pull exerted by Jensen Huang and the specialized architectures emanating from Santa Clara? By the close of 2023 and moving rapidly into the middle of 2024, the narrative around NVIDIA shifted decisively from mere supply constraints to absolute, mandatory dependence. The core product being sold was no longer just the silicon, the physical H100, or the soon-to-be-released Blackwell architecture. The product was the complete ecosystem, a seamless, deeply integrated marriage of the CUDA software platform and the highly specialized hardware architecture that collectively made the training and inference of massive trillion-parameter language models viable, efficient, and critically predictable. This realization ignited the great conflict of the contemporary tech age, the scramble for AI sovereignty. The titans of the cloud, Google with its TPUs, Amazon with its Trainium and Inferentia ASICs, Meta with massive internal investment into custom chips, were spending billions, desperately attempting to forge proprietary escape routes. Meanwhile, rival chipmakers like AMD were aggressively pushing their Instinct line, promising performance parity and competitive pricing. Yet, time and again, every rigorous benchmark, every successful large-scale LLM deployment, and every critical scientific endeavor confirmed the harsh, undeniable reality: the path of least resistance, the path of maximal stability, and often the only currently viable path to cutting-edge AI capability, ran directly through NVIDIA's meticulously managed data center product stack. The difficulty lay in the switching costs, which were not measured just in hardware expenditure, but in the years of developer productivity, specialized knowledge, and accumulated technical debt embedded within the CUDA ecosystem. CUDA wasn't just a library, it was the lingua franca of deep learning. Competing platforms required complete rewrites, retraining of entire engineering departments, and the acceptance of significant risk associated with unproven reliability at scale. No CEO or CTO facing fierce competitive pressure to deploy next-generation AI immediately could justify delaying deployment for 18 months just to save on hardware costs, especially when that delay could mean losing the AI race entirely. This trapped demand was the key catalyst justifying the vertical, impossible trajectory from $140 billion to $3 trillion. The market wasn't valuing NVIDIA on current earnings alone. It was assigning a massive multiple based on guaranteed inelastic future revenue streams derived from effective monopoly pricing power. The financial performance of the Hopper generation, particularly the H100 GPU, began to illustrate this extraordinary leverage. Reports indicated that a single H100, costing perhaps $3,000 to $5,000 to manufacture, was being sold to hyperscalers and key customers for prices ranging from $30,000 to well over $40,000, depending on volume, integration, and urgency. This translated to gross margins north of 70%, an astronomical figure typically associated only with pure software companies, not capital-intensive hardware manufacturers. NVIDIA had successfully transcended the limitations of the hardware business. It was selling acceleration. It was selling the ability to compress years of scientific discovery into months. It was, fundamentally, selling time itself. This unprecedented cash flow created a virtuous self-reinforcing cycle that further widened the competitive moat. The vast profits generated by the current generation Hopper immediately funded the relentless, highly secretive research and development required for the next generation Blackwell and the subsequent architecture. This allowed NVIDIA to maintain a perpetual aggressive 12 to 18-month lead in architectural innovation over any competitor, a gap that competitors starved for similar capital resources and burdened by the difficulty of building a comparable software ecosystem from scratch simply could not close. The $3 trillion valuation, therefore, wasn't the peak of irrational exuberance. It was the interim staging point before the next architectural leap. The pressure point escalated from mere corporate competition to something geopolitical. The race for sovereignty, which nations controlled the future of national defense, economic modeling, localized large language models, and critical scientific discovery. The immediate answer resided squarely in Santa Clara. dictating that governments around the world were now mandated customers, purchasing NVIDIA clusters not for profit, but for national security. This institutional and governmental demand guarantees an enduring baseline of revenue, irrespective of corporate investment cycles. The structural development reached its crescendo with the revelation of the Blackwell architecture. Blackwell, scheduled for aggressive deployment immediately following the peak success of the H100, served as the ultimate pattern interrupt, just as competitors were finally beginning to ship chips designed to theoretically compete with Hopper. NVIDIA announced a massive leap forward, introducing designs that drastically increased chip-to-chip communication speeds, exponentially improving model training times and integrating powerful specialized features for trillion-parameter models. Blackwell demonstrated NVIDIA's core strategy: never pause. The company doesn't wait for competitors to catch up. It immediately pivots to the next foundational bottleneck, thereby rendering any competitive parity efforts obsolete before they even hit volume production. This constant innovation proves that the moat isn't static. It is actively and rapidly expanding. The focus shifted from merely building faster processors to building massive, interconnected AI factories, entire computing ecosystems designed from the ground up to solve problems that had not even been fully articulated yet. This re-engagement, the realization that NVIDIA wasn't just building chips but dictating the rules of engagement for the future of computations, solidified the massive market capitalization. This wasn't merely about market valuation, it was about achieving the impossible, becoming the sole supplier of the foundational infrastructure during the greatest gold rush in technological history, all while controlling the software tools required to utilize that infrastructure. The climax arrived with the understanding of the cyclical nature of demand for AI infrastructure. AI is not a fixed application. It is a continuous, self-reinforcing cycle of increasing computational hunger. Once a company starts down the path of advanced AI, the need for faster, denser, and more powerful compute resources only accelerates. Datasets grow larger, models become more complex, and the competitive necessity to deploy newer, smarter algorithms increases the demand for the next generation of GPUs. This demand curve is inelastic because failing to buy the latest AI infrastructure is tantamount to accepting competitive obsolescence. The final piece of the puzzle justifying the $3 trillion valuation is therefore the guaranteed pricing power and the forward revenue streams derived from this state of perpetual digital scarcity. The market is pricing in the sustained dominance of NVIDIA across every facet of AI, training, inference, edge computing, robotics, and industrial digital twinning. When governments must have AI capability, when every major tech company must automate its core functions, the provider of the fundamental toolkit holds the ultimate leverage. The valuation is a direct reflection of guaranteed monopoly rents in the single most critical, highest growth layer of modern computation. The conclusion is definitive. The journey from a $140 billion graphics vendor to a $3 trillion AI infrastructure superpower in 2 short years wasn't a mere statistical anomaly or a fluke of market timing. It was the inevitable structural consequence of decades of disciplined architectural focus, culminating precisely at the moment the global economy required a singular scalable solution for massive parallel processing. NVIDIA successfully navigated the transition from being a hardware component supplier to becoming the essential operating system provider for the age of acceleration. They achieved the technological singularity where one company, through the twin pillars of CUDA and cutting-edge silicon, now holds the uncontested keys to infinite digital acceleration, effectively setting the pace for global technological evolution. They are the infrastructure. We have charted the incredible ascent, witnessed the construction of the impenetrable moat, and analyzed the core economic forces that propelled NVIDIA past the $3 trillion threshold. But the story is far from over. The immense market power now concentrates vast regulatory and competitive risks. The question shifts from how they achieve this dominance to how they will sustain it under intense scrutiny, and whether competitors like AMD and Intel can ever truly close the architectural and ecosystem gap. Join us next time as we dissect the true regulatory pressures facing this behemoth and examine the critical competitive dynamics that threaten to shape the next chapter of the AI arms race.